folks, and welcome to the Global Democracy Coalition Forum event on the enablers of malign finance. We are going to be talking not only about kleptocrats and oligarchs, but also the increasing focus in recent years, weeks, and days this week on the financial and legal systems of democratic countries that are used to enable corruption and kleptocracy. We're going to get started now, and while we are going through some introductory remarks, please go ahead and submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll spend the second half of our hour answering those questions. I'm Josh Rudolph, the fellow for malign finance at the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy, and we have here today the world's leading experts on the enablers of malign finance. We've got Michel, author of the new book, American Kleptocracy. We've got Lakshmi Kumar, policy director at Global Financial Integrity. Will Fitzgibbon, senior reporter at the ICIJ, International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Sydney Freedberg, chief reporter at the ICIJ. And Neil Jeans, principal consultant at Initialism. These are the right folks to have in our virtual room and to hear from this week, because just yesterday, the White House released its first ever U.S. government strategy to combat corruption, with issue number 1 being stopping oligarchs and kleptocrats from abusing the U.S. financial system, including through enablers. And at the same time, the Treasury Department yesterday initiated some regulatory processes, more just within the past hour on beneficial ownership. And the administration is working on Congress on expanding authorities. We are going to get to all of that. We're going to talk about what we learned also from the Pandora Papers, including the role of U.S.-based enablers, and also what other democracies should do as well. But I want to start with the beating heart of the system of offshore financial secrecy, the United States. We know that now. Not just because of the dollar and our banking system, but because of these professional enablers who handle dirty money. If there is one book for you to read on that topic, it is American Kleptocracy, just out a few weeks ago, authored by our first panelist today. So Casey, one of the most fascinating parts of your book was the original reporting around how much non-bank professionals know about malign finance, from real estate agents in Cleveland to the speedboat company workers in Florida, the auction houses in Beverly Hills. Like a good investigative reporter, you got on a plane, went out to these places, knocked on doors, and asked and found out just how much information they're sitting on about foreign kleptocrats and dirty money. And the real scandal is that they're not legally required to proactively share that information with law enforcement. So tell us, Casey, tell us about how these professional enablers are selling, more than just buildings, boats, and crystal gloves. They're selling American kleptocracy.
Yeah, Josh, thanks so much for that generous introduction. Obviously, it's an honor to be here with you and everyone else on this panel, to say nothing of the fact that we are speaking in this really unprecedented week that we've, we're 2 days into it already, and we've already seen more momentum, more discussion, certainly more policy proposals put forward right here in the U.S. and frankly, we've ever seen, or at least seen in the last few decades. I know we'll be talking more about that as we move forward. The topic that we're discussing today on this panel is certainly one that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the enablers. These are the Western professional classes that effectively enable kleptocrats abroad to enter the U.S. financial system and launder their ill-gotten gains into legitimate above-board assets. So I want to take just a few minutes, because I know we only have an hour to get through all of this, just to highlight how these enabling classes have really transformed over the past few decades into the gatekeepers of the U.S. financial system, and how they've used a whole range, a whole potpourri of loopholes, exemptions, and policies to transform entire industries right here in the United States of America into laundering services for kleptocratic clients. So when we're talking about enablers, I think we might actually, at this point, have a fairly good idea of who we're actually talking about. I know, Josh, you just ran through a few of these classes, but we're talking about groups like real estate agents, who in the U.S. are able to exploit wide open loopholes and 2-decade-old exemptions from basic anti-money laundering checks in order to sell gargantuan assets to anyone with a bit of dirty money. And again, we're talking about both commercial and residential real estate, as well as luxury real estate on top of that. We're talking about private equity and hedge fund managers who are able to open their funds to any anonymous kleptocratic clients they would like and keep those assets safe for years on end, effectively turning this kind of dirty money laundromat to the long cycle. We're talking about those who set up shell companies and the trusts in states like Delaware and South Dakota. I know, Josh, we're going to have more to say on that, given some of the information that just came out just today, right here in Washington, here in the U.S., that allows these corrupt and kleptocratic clients to anonymize their wealth while still controlling it nonetheless. So we're talking about a whole range of industries, professionals, luxury goods providers, accountants, escrow agents, all of whom don't have to conduct any anti-money laundering checks, any due diligence checks whatsoever. And I know, and we're also talking most especially about lawyers and law firms. And I think, Sydney, you're going to be talking a little bit more about this when we get to it. But just to introduce this, American law firms have really transformed into what I describe as this kind of first among equals status for the broader enabling classes. And I'm not talking about representation in court. Everybody obviously deserves equal representation under the law, but there are, so, speaking in 2021, there are so many services beyond just in-court representation that these law firms now provide. They do everything for their clients that are looking to, again, construct these transnational illicit financial networks. They oversee the shell company creation. They oversee major purchases. They use their own in-house accounts to skirt basic anti-money laundering regulations in the U.S. They're now running PR campaigns. They're now pushing pro-offshoring policies in Washington, and they're also, by the way, intimidating any investigative journalists that are looking into some of these networks. And they're attempting to cloak so much of this under the guise of attorney-client privilege. It's not always applicable, but there's certainly a wide writ for that. So I think, laying some of those out, you can see why lawyers are kind of put in a class of their own here in the U.S. as it pertains to enabling. I guess in so many ways, without these enabling classes of professionals and all these loopholes that they use and abuse, kleptocracy as we know it in the 21st century would cease to exist. I'm not talking about kleptocracy as one regime or one government dedicated to pillaging local populations, but I'm talking about kleptocracy as this transnational phenomenon, this creation of transnational illicit financial flows in which illicit, ill-gotten gains cross borders and look to be hidden and laundered, especially in the West, and certainly, as we're talking about right now, in the United States of America. I think to answer your question, Josh, in so many ways, without these enablers, there is no modern kleptocracy as we know it. Just as a final comment, I don't want to end on too depressing of a note, because we are speaking in wildly optimistic times, or at least relatively optimistic times, given what we've seen just in the last few weeks and especially the last few days. Just yesterday, the White House released an unprecedented strategy document to counter corruption right here in the U.S., but obviously setting the tone and setting the precedent for Democratic allies elsewhere. It's a 38-page document. It's well worth a read, but there is a section in there on enablers specifically, and I just want to pull one quick quote on that, where the White House says in this new strategy document that these enablers, quote, help raise funds, provide advice on investments, structure transactions, and can serve as an access point to the U.S. and international financial systems, including by facilitating the creation of opaque corporate vehicles. Again, those are things like shell companies. Additionally, complicit professionals are often sought by criminal organizations to facilitate their illicit activities. And I'll end the quote there. Boy, that's pointed language from the White House, but that's really what it comes down to, and why the timing for this panel couldn't be better.
Well, pointed language from the White House, pointed language from the author of the leading book on American kleptocracy. And I mean, so speaking of that report out yesterday, this may sound a bit vain, but like when a major official report comes out that the government's been working on all year, what think tankers, or at least I'll speak for myself, often do is like we look up to see whether or not our work is cited in there, and the answer was no for every single think tanker in town except for one, and that's our next panelist, Lakshmi Kumar, policy director at GFI. The White House report cited her terrific new report on real estate, issued 3 months ago called Acres of Money Laundering. And, rather than being satisfied with that, Lakshmi published another report last week advocating for anti-money laundering rules on U.S. investment advisors. Casey mentioned as well, hedge fund managers and private equity firms. And, sure enough, yesterday's White House report included what may have been thrown in there last week after the release of that report, a paragraph committing to taking a look at that issue as well. So congrats, Lakshmi, on the policy impact. And maybe you can kind of talk us through the regulatory needs around real estate and investment advisors, those two sectors that the administration is saying that they could and may well be able to regulate under existing authorities. Lakshmi.
One, thank you, Josh, for the incredible generosity. A lot of our reports is, we have them reviewed by people like Josh, people like within the larger civil society, but also a lot of it, is you can only do policy when you have stories to tell. And it is a product of all the great work that ICIJ, Miami Herald, a lot of, small town newspapers all over this country that have put the stories, invested the resources. And that's why, we're able to craft the narrative and make fancy little infographics that, everyone seems to like and garnered a lot of attention. But it is, I think, it is the product and reflection of of this larger space in which all of us work. And I will say, Josh, I know we have 5 minutes. You don't have to lightly hint. You can be very heavy-handed with your hinting and say, Lakshmi, it's time to move on. We've got others. But I will say, when we talk about the real estate, and I think the real estate sector is a good gateway sector to talk about the larger problems in the US and Europe, but in many parts of the developed world that act as a safe haven for the illicit wealth in the rest of the world. It is at its heart, what we're talking about is a complex relationship between one being the countries and governments that set the rules, that enforce the rules, that also play the role of good guys. But at the same time, those advantages of a strong democracy, a strong rule of law means there is sometimes not enough scrutiny about the gaps on the home front, which allow people to invest money, but at the same time, the protections of rule of law, democracy, a good court system also means that there are strong enforcement of these rights that don't disappear. And so, one, I think it's important that the document and our report, everyone's efforts finally gets the government to acknowledge that and actually be proactive. Now, in terms of the regulatory efforts, when we talk about real estate, I think it's important to note that what we're talking about currently is the current rule just looks at, in 22 metropolitan areas in the country, it looks at purchases of homes using like a company, an LLC that's bought in all cash. Now, this is inadequate for several reasons, primarily of which is the flawed assumption that money laundering takes place in only real estate luxury markets. The truth is that it is a problem across the country, in every small town, in every economically depressed place. If there is an opportunity to exploit, people will exploit. And that's what we've seen. And so it's important that and that's what the rule is finally allowing us. The new rule that was announced yesterday allows us this opportunity, because it's no longer just a disclosure, because earlier it was like, if I buy with a company, let me know who's bought it. Now we have an opportunity where it's asking us the question, should they do a full CDD check? Should you ask a full customer due diligence? Ask them where they get their money from, how they've made the money, check it frequently. And it's also asking the question, should be extended to lawyers, real estate agents, a whole host of professionals that assist and enable this. And finally, the big sort of elephant in the room, just commercial real estate. And I remember when Josh and I were on a panel with very recently, I said, the Iranian government put $500 million in US commercial real estate. We don't, close to 10 years from that event, we still don't have a rule on commercial real estate. So that's another big piece that, the new approach will take. And I realize I have 2 minutes more, so I will quickly move on to investment advisors. And I think there is this assumption, and I think it's important to set this context, is when we talk about criminals and money laundering, there is this desire to think of people who hide illicit wealth as not very intelligent and not very sophisticated. And both are false assumptions and patently wrong, because criminals look at their enterprise as a business. If you're a corrupt politician, being corrupt in politics is a family business, and you want to keep that going for as long as you can. And you will look at long-term horizons and growth for that business. And that's where you think of the role of private equity hedge funds, because we see people invest them in the US market, which is worth at over 11 trillion. And the whole asset management industry in the US is actually bigger than the economy of many countries and bigger than the US economy itself. And the sad truth is that no one is asking anyone questions. Tomorrow, by some miracle, end up with $100 million. I walk into a hedge fund, no one will ask me questions. And what we're seeing is that, drug cartels and others are putting money through these funds and laundering it or investing in it for long term. And so what this rule, which we hope, and the report, which will finally take a look, is to look at the people that will take the money, invest this money, make them ask questions, make them do due diligence. I will stop right now because I know my time is up, but I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Thanks, Lakshmi. I mean, I for one, am so glad that the rule makers are reading your work around, like you said, investment advisors, but also on real estate. I mean, it was you who provided that data around how the geographic targeting orders they only cover like less than two thirds of the actual cases in the United States, because they're limited to certain cities, and the need to go, not only to commercial and to these other sectors, but also to a broader set of actors. And that's what really shocked me. I have been pushing Treasury to be aggressive all year, but I didn't think they were going to go so far as they did yesterday in saying not only beneficial ownership nationwide permanently for title insurers, but also, hey, commenters, what do you think about beneficial ownership disclosure rules for a broader set of actors, including lawyers and realtors? And what about full AML obligations for the entire real estate sector? That is something that we have been waiting for 20 years. And now Treasury is at least talking about, asking about going there. And they don't do that willy-nilly. They will have thought about their resource constraints and their ability to do that. So that was frankly the biggest thing that came out yesterday. But having covered those sectors where Treasury has all of the authorities that it needs, let's turn to the sectors that are just as important, if not more, but would require congressional legislation like the Enablers Act, which was introduced in response to the Pandora Papers. And we are very fortunate to have the ICIJ Pro here, who led the Pandora Papers reporting on the U.S. financial system, Will Fitzgibbon, who has also coordinated media partnerships all over the world and is an expert on trust administrators and other types of professional enablers. So Will, can you review for us what the Pandora Papers taught us about the world capital of secret trusts not being on some Caribbean island, but being in Sioux Falls, South Dakota? Who are the thugs and crooks who use the services of providers like Trident Trust? And how does the statutory and regulatory structure in South Dakota make that possible?
Hi, Josh, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. A few disclaimers first. I'm definitely not an expert. Josh, Lakshmi, you would know this well from my pleading emails that I often send when I ask you to help me please understand some new law or regulation that's just been published. This is a fiendishly complex field, as I think most experts would agree. What trusts are we talking about? What covers them legally and regulatorily and what doesn't? And then in order not to give my ICIJ bosses and our lawyer a headache, I should say that the Pandora Papers and the revelations that they contain on the US trust industry that I'll speak to, just like Lakshmi said, don't involve people unsophisticated or stupid enough to say, hi there, I'm a criminal and a thug. Can you help me set up a trust in Sioux Falls? Right? The documents that we have do really for the first time speak to this booming South Dakota trust industry, worth $370 billion now in assets under management. And as significant as the Pandora Papers was, our trusts, the trusts that we discovered through painstaking months and years searching for key terms in these 12 million leaked documents, they really speak to trusts of probably about $500 million owned by foreigners in particular. which is a hell of a lot of money, certainly for someone on a journalist's salary, but actually isn't a lot of money when you're talking about $370 billion, is it? And I think that's really one of the sobering realizations of something like the Pandora Papers is, even with almost 12 million records from around the world, and even with the biggest set of leaked information from the US trust industry to journalists in history, we still are only seeing a tiny slice of what's going on. And that was I think the chilling factor that went down my spine so often reporting the Pandora Papers. You know, every time I saw a former advisor to a Guatemalan president with a trust in Sioux Falls, or a billionaire Brazilian brother to a senator whose companies have been investigated for bribery and corruption, or a Brazilian millionaire who's been fined in the United States and investigated in Brazil a number of times. Every time I saw those characters, I also kept thinking, well, who aren't we seeing? Whose records will we never see or have we not seen yet about foreigners in particular setting up trusts in South Dakota? And that's significant really because nothing in my reporting, in speaking to experts and speaking to one insider from the South Dakota banking industry, nothing really assuaged me that South Dakota currently, and a number of other US states that are also engaged in this race to the bottom, have the experience or the mindset in place that something is wrong, potentially wrong, and that they need to do more to monitor that. You know, there's a reason why South Dakota, population 880,000, and with a part-time legislature, has a $370 billion trust industry. It's not because these foreigners are enjoying visiting Mount Rushmore and, you know, visiting the quaint coffee shops on the main street of Sioux Falls. In many cases, it's because these small legislatures are both desperate for bells and whistles of potential new revenue. So when a trust company, lobbyist, tells them, hey, why don't you introduce this trust law? You'll get a whole bunch of new jobs for young South Dakotans who can work as lawyers or trust company advisors. Lots of these legislators from Alaska to Wyoming to South Dakota and other places as well, kind of roll over and go, sure, sounds like a good idea to me. You know, the thing I heard time and time again was a theme on what someone in South Dakota said who heads their auditing department, which is the trust industry doesn't harm anything except trees that are used to print the legislation that trust legislation are printed on. And I think that was a moment for me, because I think why we're on this call and why we're talking about this is the recognition that trusts in the United States, but also around the world, have been central parts of so many kleptocratic schemes from time immemorial, right? From Sonny Abacha to Ferdinand Marcos, and probably in the future we'll be seeing to other kleptocratic exposés that probably involve United States trusts. And really how we got here, of course, was those small states who took the bait, I think, of the trust lobbyists who sold these states on the advantages that such an industry would bring, but then were never really able to keep up with the oversight that is required. You know, I spoke to a South Dakota banking insider who basically despaired, despaired at the lack of experience and international ability of people within Sioux Falls to really know what's going on. This idea of, I'll do a Google search within South Dakota's borders, but anything beyond that, let alone in another language, and I'm kind of tapping out. You know, I spoke to a Wyoming trust officer at one time who said, I don't have time to go searching on Google for news around the world. I just check to see what my clients are up to in the state of Wyoming. Well, guess what? A Russian billionaire probably doesn't do very much in Wyoming, at least that you're going to find on a Bing or Google search. So I think that tension between the federal and the state level is very evident in this trust industry, and I think has allowed this system to grow in a way in which assets and foreigners have really outstripped the knowledge and ability of the United States at a state level to catch up.
Well, thanks, Will, for your you know, like Casey, it's the, you know, the investigative journalism on the ground, going out to somebody's got to go to Sioux Falls to figure out who's talking to who and what their kind of agenda is, or who knows what or doesn't know, and you are the person doing it. Let us now turn to the person who is leading the charge on the other sector that calls for legislation around enablers, maybe the greatest enabler sector of them all, lawyers. So it is to the great chagrin of the global law firms who help hide, move, and store dirty money on behalf of malign actors that the journalist who is leading the beat on this reporting is the 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner, Sidney Freedberg. So tell us, Sidney, what did the Pandora Papers, I guess, first of all, like reveal about how firms like Baker McKenzie, biggest law firm in the United States, evolved from being pioneers in corporate tax dodging to now being enablers of notorious tycoons, Russian arms makers, kleptocrats like Joe Low and Igor Kolomoisky. And then also, like, more broadly, how does the problem extend to other law firms as well? And how has the industry resisted anti-money laundering reform?
Well, thanks, Josh. Well, this has been pretty inspirational, and at the risk of sounding like the Grinch here, I'm not so upbeat about offshore reform. My sources tell me that the Enablers Act probably has a 10% chance of passing, and certainly not in the form that it is, right? And if it does become law, then it might not help as much as you think, especially when it comes to lawyers, which is what I'm supposed to talk about here. And I will talk about this a little later, but in my view, what I've kind of discovered is that for lawyers, at least, this is maybe more of a question about ethics than it is even about law, because, and I can discuss this later, but so much of this is in sort of a shady, shadowy area of legality, right? So let's talk about the lawyers a little bit. Experts tell me, and I think Josh is one of them, that lawyers are the most important enablers to regulate. And that's because most offshore abuses can't occur without the help of a lawyer. American lawyers have no, as was noted before by Casey, who calls lawyers henchmen in his book. I wouldn't go that far, but I take the point. American lawyers have no legal or any other obligation to check the source of funds they're working with. People have tried to change this for 30 years or so, but for 30 years, the legal establishment has torpedoed every effort to regulate lawyers. And they say that mandatory rules would hurt businesses, that it would threaten their right to privacy. And invariably, the legal industry brandishes its most potent argument, which is, as Casey mentioned, attorney-client privilege. And I'm with the lawyers on this, okay? There's a centuries-old protection of a client's private communications with a lawyer from disclosure to the state, and it's considered a pillar of Western constitutional law. And we don't want lawyers to have to go, we want to be able to, if we're a criminal or whatever, and we have a lawyer, we want to be able to tell that lawyer everything, right? Without the fear of that lawyer going to the government. And the crafty people who wrote the Enablers Act wrote it taking this in mind. It's actually a very good first start, right? But the lawyers are going to say it's not, and they're going to go after this again. So now, as Casey mentioned, we're not talking about courtroom work for these guys, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the elite lawyers. I'm not talking about the mom and pops. I'm talking about the international law firms with the most revenue. And as Casey gave a rundown of what they do, it's everything essentially except for courtroom work, right? And it's, he mentioned everything, and all of that is in our leaked documents and outside of the documents as well. Prosecutors tell me that when they investigate money laundering, that money laundering is like the first cousin to public corruption, right, and bribery. So that the funds used for bribery are often laundered through shell businesses or attorney accounts. And when a cop starts looking hard at money laundering, bingo, they often find a rogue state or a kleptocrat or a bribery scheme behind the money laundering. So few firms stand out in this as much as Baker McKenzie. Baker McKenzie calls itself the first global law firm, and our research shows that the firm's founder, Russell Baker, and his successors helped build the modern offshore economy and shaped financial laws around the world. And the firm pioneered and promoted aggressive tax avoidance strategies used by corporations to shift profits to tax havens. And while they help these corporate giants, right, move their wealth offshore, they have a few like bad guys who are sprinkled into the mix. So a lot of what they do, or probably most or all of what they do, is, you know, probably perfectly legal, right? Except maybe it's not right, right? So on the bad side, some of the Baker McKenzie and its affiliates, they helped build a network of companies for Jolo, who's the fugitive Malaysian millionaire at the center of a huge public corruption scandal. They helped a Ukrainian oligarch named Igor Kolomoisky, who's also involved in a massive money laundering scandal. They helped a Chinese steel kingpin by the name of Du Shuanghua, who was involved in a bribery scandal. And they also helped about a half a dozen Russian companies, state companies under sanction. And one of my favorites is the Rostek, the Russian maker of AK-47s, which helped Baker helped Rostek sell its stake in an Mongolian mine to a shell company, partly owned by Goldman Sachs and a Mongolian oligarch. So, and that transaction triggered a corruption probe involving at least one former Mongolian president. Who else do we have? We had Baker helping an offshore company linked to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. They helped him buy a $500 million yacht before, of course, he became a suspect in the murder of the Washington Post reporter. And then we have Baker helping authoritarian Chinese companies, including at least three companies that were blacklisted by the US government, two of which were accused of fraud by the World Bank in public projects. And another company, AVIC, which is the maker of drones, which AVIC sells its drones to despotic regimes who then sell them to other people who use them to kill civilians. Okay. So, and Baker is not alone. While it's probably it has one of the biggest offshore presences, it's certainly not alone. Another firm is White and Case, has an active business with offshore providers. One of the firm's top lawyers, who happens to be a former president of the American Bar Association, worked for a lobbyist for Uzbekistan. She also lobbied for Libya and Zaire. Then we have DLA Piper, which also helped Jolo buy a $39 million mansion, running his money through their account, one of their trust accounts. And we have a DLA Piper also drew up a secret offshore military deal between Chinese and Ukrainian companies. We also have Greenberg Traurig, which helped the rogue banker Alan Stanford carry out a worldwide Ponzi scheme. And Greenberg also did lobbying for autocrats in Kazakhstan, oligarchs in Belarus, and a dictator in Azerbaijan. Then we have Casey's favorite, Teodoro Obiang, who's the son of the prime minister. And we have Sidley Austin helping him buy a $40 million Gulfstream jet with stolen money. And Sidley Austin was so worried about it that they went to the Justice Department before they did the deal and said, "Are we okay doing the deal?" And the Justice Department said, "Yeah, it's fine." And so I'll end there.
Well, that is quite the motley crew of kleptocrats and their lawyers around the world. And I have a bit more faith that legislation, at some point, there's going to be political will around this issue, thanks to the work that you are doing, telling the world about what these firms are up to. And now, speaking of legislation around anti-money laundering rules for enablers, having covered it in the United States, let's go down under to the only other democracy that's similarly non-compliant with all three international standards on regulating enablers, FATFs, Recs 22, 23, and 28. Australia's anti-money laundering system is actually pretty similar to the United States. It's well developed, but it only covers banks, casinos, gold dealers, a couple of others. And so, when those financial service providers were covered in the first tranche of Australian legislation in 2006, the government promised to follow up soon with what's known as Tranche 2, covering non-financial enablers, the ones that we've been discussing today. It would be the Australian version of the Enablers Act, but it's been a decade and a half, and Tranche 2 has been repeatedly mired in endless bureaucratic shuffling, statutory reviews, project plans, cost-benefit analyses, successive governments ultimately failing to deliver. So let's hear from Neil Jeans, who has been working on these issues around the world for over 25 years, going back to the 90s as one of the thought leaders on how the international system should regulate non-bank enablers. So Neil, how do you see this effort proceeding today, and why has the Australian government now spent 15 years promising to enact Tranche 2? What gives, and what could Prime Minister Morrison potentially say this week at the Summit for Democracy that would match this rising level of ambition in the United States?
Thank you, Josh. And again, first and foremost, congratulations to the US for actually starting to make progress in this journey. And I think we also need to recognise that, despite the concerns, the wild allegations, the hyperbole that the lawyers, accountants, and real estates throw at this problem, it is an experience globally that the world doesn't collapse, the world doesn't stop turning simply because they are regulated for anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. As you said, Josh, I've been looking at this problem since the early 1990s, when I was involved in the investigation of a gentleman called Stephen Sakosha, who's currently doing 660 years in a federal penitentiary for laundering the Cali and Medellin cartel drug funds. He extensively used corporate structures to launder the proceeds and ultimately commit further crimes, including stock frauds. So this is a problem that's been going on for many, many, many years. And over time, the industry and governments have realized that this is a problem. The main catalyst was the 2003 change to bring designated non-financial businesses and professions into the FATF standards. That was a catalyst which was taken up by many, many countries. But as we sit here today, you're completely correct. There are currently, I would classify 4 countries that are let's call them laggards, because it's a term we like to use in Australia, particularly in relation to our government. Laggards in relation to climate change and lots of other problems that we have down here. There are laggards in this space. They are the United States, and we've seen there's progress there, Australia, and those 2 other great financial services centers, Haiti and Madagascar. So to put it in perspective, we are in a club of 4. And the other 2, quite frankly, aren't necessarily punching the same level as we are. We have recognised this problem in Australia for many, many years, as Josh says. The legislation changed in 2006, and it was shadowed the Tranche 2. The second phase of the legislation would bring enablers into this legislation in somewhere around 2010. That unfortunately didn't happen, and as we sit here today, we effectively have Tranche 2 hard. It just simply is too difficult for the government down here to put in place. That is despite an FATF mutual evaluation in 2014, which identified this as a significant weakness. Australia was one of the first countries to be put through the 2014 mutual evaluation, to the fourth round mutual evaluation process. So we've known for longer than anybody else. To put it in perspective, obviously, US was 2018-19. So, you're almost light speed compared to what Australia is undertaking. That was backed up by a statutory review by the government in 2016, which identified the same issues. But to date, we simply do not have the legislation. The reason for that is quite simply political will. And I reflect on the comments by Marcus Planer, the chairman of the FATF, the president of the FATF, even around the G20 summit in Italy recently, where he simply said, there are countries that are not following the FATF standards, and a big driver is political will. Why does that political will not exist? Well, I think that simply comes back to lobbying, pressure from interest groups around the world, in particularly in the enablers. We have in Australia a current Senate inquiry going on to assess the AML-CTF regime, which is due to report in March. If we get to there from a federal government perspective, we're due for an election in the next 6 months, and they have identified obviously this is a significant issue. But we're still faced with the situation where the lawyers, particularly, are basically in denial. I refer to them as flat earthers. They simply do not believe this problem exists. They believe they are a special class, and they believe that they should be exempt from the laws that every other party that is involved in a financial transaction is covered by. And as a result, we have a situation where criminals, and they are smart criminals based on my experience, go to the weakest link. And the weakest link is basically countries that have not enabled this legislation. And we see it here as well. To take example on the property prices, we have an incredibly expensive property market. We are seeing significant property inflation, and a vast majority of that is simply because of overseas money coming into a stable property market. And that is, again, across every stratosphere. It's not the high-end multi-million-dollar mansions. It's down to the small investment properties. It's into the commercial property. And that has a serious knock-on effect, not only for the economy, because money is transitory, but also for the future of the country, because simply it's going to be virtually impossible for children that are born today to actually ever afford to buy a house. Because unless you're earning, $250,000, $300,000 a year, you simply won't be able to afford the mortgage. So we are in a difficult position here. To answer your question, Josh, about what should be done? Well, what can Mr. Morrison do? Quite simply, do what is required and meet the international commitments that Australia has made. That's simply it. Introduce this law. It could be introduced as a stroke of a pen by amending one table in the Act to bring the services that these enablers provide into the legislation, and then we would have a basis for regulation. I appreciate we're coming close to time, so Josh, I'll stop there with my comments, and obviously happy to take any questions that come through.
That sounds terrific. I mean, as the two democracies that do, it's like over 100 democracies in the world, and we just cannot accept the situation. It's unacceptable that the United States and Australia are the two that just don't have these laws in place simply because lawyers. I mean,
we're behind Cuba and Pakistan.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to open up for Q&A. As a reminder, to ask a question, just go to the bottom of your screen, click Q&A, ask your question. It will only be viewable to the hosts and panelists, and we are eager to ask. So go ahead, and I guess we'll start on the issue where Neil just left off, of the need for political will. I'm going to ask. Speaking of wills, Mr. Fitzgibbon, about this as it relates to South Dakota Trust, because we have this question about are there any genuine efforts in the states, including South Dakota and Wyoming, to get citizens involved in reforming the U.S. trust industry? What have you seen in your reporting on the political space in those states?
I think what I found and what I heard speaking to lawmakers or the few people who were even aware of the topic of trusts is that it's too complicated and just not interesting enough for many people to pay attention to. Part of that's deliberate, I think, but you know, it's not the kind of thing that makes front page news, and it's not the kind of thing that gets people protesting in local assemblies. You know, I once spoke to a trust lawyer from Oklahoma Law School who basically said what the trust industry needs is a case like Free Britney Spears. If there's a Free Britney Spears case that can be applied to an abuse of trust or a kleptocrat using a trust, or a child who's not got child support because of a trust, then maybe these kind of state laws would start getting the attention they deserve. But absent that, I think it's going to be a hard slog, and we've seen that in South Dakota since the Pandora Papers. You know, there has been, I think, a lot more interest in South Dakota trusts in Washington, D.C. than there has been in Sioux Falls. You know, there's a hearing tomorrow at Congress tomorrow that is basically at least half about South Dakota trusts, whereas to my knowledge, the governor of South Dakota hasn't put out a statement. She declined to go to the hearing tomorrow, by the way. And lawmakers generally have said it's a nothing burger. That said, you know, I've heard rumors that the state is conscious of reputational damage, and that there might be some tweaks on the legislative calendar at the beginning of next year. But I completely agree with the premise of the question, which is that journalists and lawmakers and civil society do need to do more to explain why these subjects matter. You know, to move the needle so that it's no longer, because we're here because kleptocracy mutates, right, and changes. And I think people are so used to this idea of a Nigerian kleptocrat walking into a hotel or a Swiss bank with a suitcase stuffed with cash. But be it real estate, private equity, trusts, you know, white-shoed lawyers in high rises in Manhattan, that's changed so much now that the storytelling aspect, which I guess is what I'm involved in, really has to change to keep up with that. And sometimes we're slower than we should be.
American kleptocracy.
Yeah, Josh, can I jump in for just a second to build off what Will just said? You know, Will's exactly right. There is such little, if any, incentive structure for these states, for state-based legislators, to change the actual financial architecture and regulatory oversight regimes in those states. And we're talking about South Dakota, we're talking about Wyoming, places like Nevada, places like Delaware, smaller states, relatively overlooked states, those that have crafted these kinds of regulatory policies that attract and incentivize the inflows of this illicit, questionable, suspect, anonymous, you name it, wealth. You know, I think one of the great points that Will made earlier when he was talking with legislators is that they tend to confine, willingly or otherwise, their searches for any concerning information to what these actors, these figures, these networks are actually doing in the state. Because if you think about it at a 10,000-foot level, the damage to South Dakota, the actual real material damage to South Dakota, to South Dakotans, to the South Dakota legislature, much of it is just reputational. They are creating a certain number of jobs. They are creating financial inflows that benefit the state themselves. Now, obviously, this is overlooking the great, great, great damage to those populations in Brazil, in the Dominican Republic, in Guatemala, in Nigeria, in China, Russia, you name it. But if they confine that aspect to those, whether it's the state themselves or even just their constituents, they can talk themselves into creating, strengthening, and entrenching those regimes. And what we now know is that these states, so speaking in the American case itself, these states, there's very little incentive for them to change, which is why so much of the onus is increasingly on, or appears to be on, the federal government in terms of response itself. Obviously, we'll see where things go right now, but the incentive structure for the states to change and these legislators to change is just so negligible right now. It will be a surprise if there is any organic push on the ground in places like South Dakota, Nevada, Delaware, Wyoming to actually change anything that we've seen so far.
Well, so speaking of incentive structures, let's tackle two more great questions that have come in around political financing, including foreign political financing potentially. So one, can the United States fix malign finance issues by only targeting foreign financing in the U.S. Political donation system and relating lobbying activities? And then there's another question, and then I'll just open it as a jump ball for whoever wants to. But what are your thoughts on how malign finance can be used by one state to capture the politics of another, especially in the case of Russia, with their use of corruption networks to influence political outcomes?
I'm happy to go, and I'll keep it short so that the others can jump in. On the first question on sort of political financing in the US, what I will say is that, and to keep this really within the realm of legislation, is that the new beneficial ownership legislation, while it does many things, the one thing that it does stay away from and continues to stay from is the issue of campaign finance. So nonprofits that are registered in the form of a trust, there is a specific exemption crafted, and that is one of the challenges of having a law that is negotiated through the process of that is, as a bipartisan legislation where you do make compromises. And the issue of campaign finance, along with the role of lawyers, accountants, were some of the areas that we had to compromise on. So yes, is there an issue? Is it present? Is it reflected in federal legislation? The answer to the first two is yes. The answer to the last question is no, it is not reflected in federal legislation. And the new rules that just came out an hour ago do sort of, solidify that exemption in the law. So I'll stop there in case anyone else wants to jump in on that question.
And if not, I'll just use a moderator's prerogative to, I've tracked a lot of foreign interference, including Russian strategic corruption around the world and infiltration into political systems and, supporting populists in Europe and activities in the United States. These are really big problems. They tend to focus on either lifting up populists, they'll sow chaos within societies generally, or going for specific types of things they want, whether it's an energy pipeline or sanctions relief or some type of geopolitical thing. It's less common that I have seen the focus of like covert foreign money from Moscow and Beijing focusing on the details of these AML systems. We produce enough problems for ourselves in our own political system, and that's really what the problem has been. It's the enablers themselves, lobbying, but also it not being treated and understood as a national security matter. And you needing unified government. So why beneficial ownership didn't happen until after the House flipped in 2018. And so you have to use those moments. Casey.
I was going to actually turn this to the Australian colleagues we have on the panel today. Obviously, Australia has dealt with any number of high-profile, concerning linkages and, as we now know, funding operations, especially in the Australian Senate. Neil or Will, do you have any further details linking of those case studies to the question that Josh posed from the questioner?
Again, difficult in terms of case studies, but I think we're coming back to one single point, which is anonymous money. This is a fundamental issue, which is the root of all these issues, and is the root of all money laundering problems going back for many, many decades. Basically, what money launderers, kleptocrats, criminals all want to achieve is anonymous money, and the issues we're talking around enablers basically are a fundamental pillar to creating anonymous money. And with that anonymity, you can do many, many different things. And again, because it's anonymous, we only, as Will says, we only see the tip of the iceberg. But it is a problem. It is a global problem. It's not a problem simply for the United States. We are as strong as the weakest link. We're down in Australia. We're expecting announcements this week around the beneficial ownership stuff. Interestingly, they were flagged in the press yesterday evening. We expect the Treasurer to come out with that in the next 2 to 3 days. But we're just one link in the chain. The problem isn't, to a certain degree, the beneficial ownership structure or the beneficial ownership register in Australia. It's the beneficial ownership registers in the countries that don't have, or the lack of registration in other countries. That's the problem. So until the world gets its house in order, until democracies and governments start to put pressure on other governments, to actually get to a common level playing field, we're still going to have this problem, and that comes back to simply anonymous money.
Well, speaking of that, of anonymous money and beneficial ownership, and the world needing to get its act together, have a special treat for you, which is that Lakshmi, as we have been sitting here, has been, so just like an hour ago, the United States released its draft beneficial ownership regulations that we've been working on all year. And as Lakshmi has been having conversation with us, she has also been scanning through this 188-page document and looking at a couple of very initial takeaways. And Lakshmi, what do you see?
No, thank you, Josh. But I did get a sense that I know Sydney had just raised a hand to make a point. So if she wants to go, I'm happy to sort of quickly follow on after that, if that's all right with you as the moderator.
I missed that, and I would love to hear Sydney's thoughts. I'm so sorry. I was not looking at that part of the screen. Sydney, what thoughts on where we just were?
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was just going to say, thank you. I was just going to say on dark money that I noticed in examining some of the law firms that they often form these groups, or they're part of a group that's the association of blah blah, or the the software association of blah blah blah, and they're all dark money groups, and they all lobby, and you never know who's behind them. And if you ask, except that maybe the law firm is, and so you ask them, well, who are you getting the money from and how much? And they'll kind of never tell you. And so that's sort of an issue. But I also wanted to just say something about ethics for a minute before. I wanted to relay a question, relay something that Steve Brill told me when I was doing my big law story. So, these law firms that we're talking about, the international law firms, their starting salaries are about 175 or 200,000. Who can resist that? Right? The law schools have no ethics, or very, very weak ethics training for lawyers. And then you have these kids who are coming out of law school. Many of them have, get loans, right, to go to law school. And so, of course, they're going to pick the big law firms, Steve Brill told me, Steve has 2 kids who I think both went to Yale, and they did not need any loans, right? And they said, no, I'm not working for those law firms, but they could afford to say that. And so I'm just making a pitch here for sort of, a lot of these questions, like, are, like some law firms sort of put themselves in pretzels trying to help billionaires and rich people. And when they should be saying, no, you can't do that, or don't do that. And I think we sort of need more sort of ethics, is my little pitch there.
We need it, they need it, and they are going to get it because of the reporting that you're doing. So thank you, Sydney. That's such great perspective, and I'm so glad it's informing our conversation and the public reporting. So what we're going to do with the last 2 minutes here is first I'll turn to Lakshmi to tell us what's to having read 188 pages of beneficial ownership regs while we're sitting here, I'm sure. What do you see? And then we'll just do a one time, or around the horn. Each of you, I would love to hear kind of hitting these last 2 questions. What's a key action item or commitment that you all would like to see coming out of this week's Summit for Democracy? Or if not an action item or commitment, then what's a country or a civil society group to keep an eye on during the Summit for Democracy? So what should we be looking at this week? But first, Lakshmi.
No, thanks, Josh. And in the interest of time, I realize we are 1 minute before 2. I'll try and keep this quick so everyone can. But the big takeaway is that this is not a full rulemaking. It only covers the reporting requirements of beneficial ownership, the pieces on access to who will have access to this information, and how verification will be done will be 2 separate rulemakings. We do not know when those rulemakings will occur, but it is in our future. This is 60-day period to give comments. Since we're talking about trusts, the rulemaking very specifically says it covers for domestic reporting companies anything that is registered with the state. So it covers business trusts that are registered with the state. Now, it is unclear how uniform that practice is across the 50 states. So we definitely know there are states where trusts don't register, but are they also business trusts is the big question there. On the face of it, it also looks like they're allowing you to name a senior officer as a beneficial owner. It's unclear if that is just an addition or if that's a way to sort of, essentially get around naming a true beneficial owner. So we're going to have to look into that a little bit more. Otherwise, it looks like they are going to as expansive a rule as possible and as rigid a rule as possible, so that at a later date, based on the comments they get, they may water it down. So on the whole, this looks like a strong rulemaking. A couple of areas, as always, we wouldn't be civil society if we didn't raise concerns about rulemaking. So a couple of areas of concerns, but this is hopeful and looking forward to the next two.
Great. Well, thank you for that initial take. Yeah, who would like to now wrap us up? We'll just go around. Who wants to go first on something to watch for this week from Sound for Democracy?
I can jump in a quick response to that, Josh. This is maybe a little bit of a dodge, but I mentioned it earlier. The White House's new strategy document for countering corruption. It came out just yesterday. It's less than 40 pages, pretty easy to get in and get out. I know it's not a civil society group, so I apologize for that, but it really is a laundry list of all these different policy proposals, all of these different elements that so many of us have been highlighting, have been calling for, have been pushing for years and years. And given it's the holiday season, it's very much kind of a Christmas come early type moment. So I know that doesn't quite answer your question, Josh, but it's a great document. I highly recommend reading through it.
Something to focus on this week. All right. Will, Sydney, Neil?
I want to see whether the Democrats move the Enablers Act and whether it's now docked up in the Financial Services Committee. I want to see what moves the Democrats make to get it out and whether they're going to make a push to get the lawyers covered.
Sorry, will you go first?
Thanks, Neil. I guess I'm not necessarily keeping an eye on this week, but more in January when some of the state legislatures reconvene to see if there are any new laws around state-regulated trusts, for example. But overall, life as an investigative journalist teaches you that most things happen not in weeks, days, and months, but years. And I'd be remiss if I didn't tell everyone on the call that when judging the Pandora Papers, give it time, and my expectation is we'll still be talking about it in 3 or 5 years when criminal indictments potentially come down in the United States and elsewhere, and it'll be just as relevant as it is in today's conversation.
And just one thing for me, which is really, these issues transcend politics. They transcend bipartisan positions. They should be bipartisan issues that should be dealt with for the good of society. And quite frankly, that's the message that anybody should be taking away from this session.
I didn't get my word in, so I will.
I
I just wanted, because we're talking about the enablers, I do want to mention there's a hearing expected in the first quarter of next year on the issue of enablers. That's going to be in the House Financial Services Committee. There's something to look out for. But if I will say, if you're going to watch out for something, watch out for all the organizations here today on this panel. I think, as Will said, it's a fight that's not done. It will take years, and there's many rulemakings, many comments, many more reports, many more panels that will come from all of us here on this panel. So watch out for all of us is what I will say. And there is a larger coalition we all belong to. And, we do a lot of great work, and, we welcome the attention. Much like everyone else in the social media age, we welcome as much attention as we can get on our work.
Well, what a great way to end. Watch out for us, kleptos and oligarchs. And I feel like we got the wind in our sails. We got action this week. We've got this whole body of reporting that's continuing. We didn't even talk about Pandora Papers data coming out yesterday, and so a lot going on from the 5 of you, the disablers of malign finance. Keep up the good work. Thanks for this fun conversation. Thank you all for joining. Thanks to the Global Democracy Coalition Forum. Signing out.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.